Welcome to the Business Trendsetter Podcast, where we talk about trends and how to use them to grow your business. My name is Manny Turan.
And my name's Adam Hartung.
We are Spark Partners. We're here every week to discuss all things business, all things trends. And one of the underlying topics that we sort of talk around but not directly at is the idea of risk. In business, in life, risk and uncertainty are kissing cousins, but there is a distinction that we want to make clear. Of course, in the vernacular and in movies and all that, they're kind of the same. But in business, and if you really look down at the DNA of these two different things, they are different, and they are fundamentally different, and they should be approached different. We're obviously going into a time of uncertainty to some degree here with the new administration. And, Adam and I try to stay apolitical as much as possible, but nonetheless, there's going to be changes. So I'm going to take that and put it in a paper airplane and send it over to you, Adam.
Well, as you were saying, people often don't distinguish the difference between uncertainty and risk, and that will lead to bad decision making. So what we want to try to do is understand, okay, we're going to have a new administration. We know that some laws are going to change, some regulations are going to change, some things are going to be different in the future. We don't know what those are. That's uncertainty. So in the face of uncertainty, the tendency is to say, I should do nothing. That's what people would like to think. But it turns out that usually doing nothing in the face of uncertainty is the worst decision that you can make. So my biggest mentor in life was probably Colonel Carl Bernard. He helped me a lot when I worked for the DuPont company, making deals around the world. And he used to tell me this story. Like whenever the bullets he was a young man in World War II, and then he became a lieutenant and an officer in Korea. And then he was head of special forces in Vietnam for several years. And so what he said, we'd teach him to use these analogies. And he said that it's very easy to teach a soldier when the bullets fly to jump in a foxhole. So that's super easy, right? I mean, what am I trying to do? Get away from the bullets, he said.
Yeah.
But what it's hard to get people to understand is that the moment they get in the foxhole, their number one job is to get out of the foxhole. Because now you're trapped, you're in a foxhole, the enemy is coming towards you, the enemy has guns, it has artillery, it's going to keep firing away. Eventually, they'll either lob a shell into the foxhole or they'll overrun your foxhole and you will die. So it's an absolute certainty if you stay in the foxhole, you will die. But the problem is what do I do? And the soldier would be like, I don't know what to do. Because I don't know what to do, I feel safe in the foxhole. So I'll continue to stay here. And they would stay in the foxhole too long and they would die. A second analogy came up after World War II, and they were in Korea. They were trying to figure out, there were so many pilots in World War II that went down with the plane. And they were like, why did they do that? Why didn't they jump out of the plane? Why didn't they hit the ejector button and get out of the plane? And the pilots, the pilots of the U.S. Air pilot, at that time, there wasn't an Air Force yet. So it was the U.S. Army Air Force. And they asked them, they said, why is it people don't jump out? And it's like all this courage and I can fly my plane and blah, blah, blah. Well, the more they studied on this and they got psychologists involved and they would replicate what would happen, they'd do drills and things. What they started to realize was that the pilots in the plane's been shot, the engine's failing or the rear end is failing, whatever's happening, this plane's going to go down. But the pilots in their head, what they knew was that they were flying a plane. And the odds were very, very, very low to zero that they would land that plane and survive. But the uncertainty was to jump out of the plane. If they jumped out of the plane or they hit the ejector button, they didn't know what was going to happen.
Yeah, I think
so. There was uncertainty.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that story is so damn powerful. The second one, we've talked about this in the past, long time ago, and it really goes to show that. And to finish the story, because once they trained him how to jump, how to eject on the ground, and they understood that it was no longer uncertain. It was a risk. Yeah, you could crush your head on the top or other things could happen, but it was a measured risk. Once that happened, it opened up a whole different world of possibilities for these pilots. I think that's an amazing concept that needs to be told over and over again.
And so now we're looking and we're saying, okay, Adam, we've been talking about trends, where the world's going. We've talked about electrification. We've talked about the environmental awareness that's gone on out there. We've talked about demographics. And now what we see is we're going to have a change in administration. It's far less supportive of the environmental stuff. It's far less supportive of diversity. It's far less supportive of the big movement to electrification. Well, they've already said that. There's nothing here that nobody doesn't know who listens to the news. But you start saying, well, what do I do now? And so in the face of the uncertainty of what they will actually do, the tendency would be to say, well, I probably shouldn't do anything. But the reality is that's wrong. You need to realize the world's going to change. So there's a long-term trend here, and then there's a short-term impact that's going to happen. And what you have to do is plan for both, because you want to be here to fight the long term. This administration will be gone and replaced by some administration in 4 years. We know that because this is a one-term president. There's no adjusting for that fact. That'll happen. So now what occurs is, well, how do I deal with this, right? And one of the things you want to do is take a look at what we know to be some of the long-term trends. So, for example, if you went back in time and you said, okay, the internet was coming along, and I was in this era and I was pushing businesses saying, look, you're going to have to get on the internet. You're going to need a website. You're going to need to start learning how to bill your customers on the internet and take payments over the internet. And I would have a lot of companies that would say, I don't know how to do that. I mean, I've done it this way, the way I'm doing it for a long time. I just want to wait. I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait. Well, what happened was the early adopters went out there and they figured out how to do it, and they became lower cost and they became closer to the customers, and they were able to take market share and eventually win, right? So what we now need to do is take a look and say, okay, long term, what do we know is going to happen? Well, let's take, for example, artificial intelligence, another trend that we've talked about. Artificial intelligence isn't going to stop because this administration is changing. It's going to happen. So now then, if you're saying, well, I'm going to go slow, what you're likely to say is, I'm not quite sure about what the regs are going to be, or I'm not quite sure perhaps about what my supply chain is going to look like. I got questions how this is all going to fall out in the next year. But what you do know is artificial intelligence is going to keep moving forward. So this is the time when you start saying, let's make those investments in the things that we can be pretty sure about, right?
Right.
Now, you might say, I don't know what to do in the term of AI, so therefore I'm going slow. And now we're back to that risk versus uncertainty. If you do nothing with AI, then there's pretty clear. I mean, you're at high risk. Every day you do nothing, your risk of your status quo risk, the risk of staying in the status quo goes up, and your chance of eventual future failure goes up with it, right? So what we need to do is say, these long-term trends we've talked about are still important to think about as you're trying to figure out kind of what decision you need to make.
Yeah, let's do this. Let's take this thought process and kind of turn it on its head. And what I mean to say about that is, we've talked about the pandemic was an accelerant of many trends. And like, for instance, the idea of movie theaters, dying a slow death. And then the pandemic comes and it's a punctuated equilibrium, of course, like we've talked about. The first time we met, you used that word and it blew my head away. But the idea is this thing happened and now it's accelerated. Now the movie theaters, many of them shut down. And so imagine if the idea of this administration is really, you've got to continue on that trend no matter what happens. And in a way, it's a punctuated equilibrium, but it's more like a bump stop, it's a dampener. It's preventing it from happening, but it's not going to stop it, right? It's going to slow down for 4 years, but it's not going to stop these trends.
Yeah. So, I mean, the ones we can be sure about, again, artificial intelligence, you should keep going after that. The other one is demographics. Nobody in 4 years is going to make a big difference in demographics. The only way you could do something would be to change immigration. If you greatly increase immigration, it would have a marginal impact. If you decrease immigration or increase the pushing people out of the country, it'll have a marginal impact. So we can look at what those marginal impacts will be, but the net of it is there's not going to be enough people. Right? The demographic pyramid's upside down. There's too few young people, too many old people. So don't think that this administration is going to have any ability to create more workers to work for you at lower pay, right? So you have to start saying, okay, the demographics are known. Now then, if the administration is going to likely move forward with fewer immigrants, and if they are going to follow through with a plan to export or deport more people, then you have to start saying that problem that I've had, which is a demographic problem, could be exacerbated in the short term. Yeah. It's kind of like the work from home. There were some people working from home. The pandemic hit. Suddenly, a lot of people had to work from home, right? It exacerbated and pushed forward a trend. If we start to reduce immigration more and export more people, then it's going to exacerbate the trend that's created by the demographics. So you can start to say, oh, okay, I can face this uncertainty with some sense of how I should be making decisions, right? I can still continue to take a look at this and start saying, well, what are my risks of one versus another? Your risk of saying, I'm going to keep trying to run my company with the same number of people, or I'm going to try to keep my company going the same direction by making a marginal improvement in pay and hoping I can keep my people. Now what's happening is you're increasing your risk of failure, right? So the measurable thing we know is the risk, and the only way we can overcome the risk is to undertake uncertainty, to go forward and say, oh, well, I'm not quite sure, but maybe I should use robotics in some way, mechanical robotics, artificial intelligence, something that would help me to get more done with fewer people, because long term, I know that's going to happen, and it might be exacerbated, or likely will be exacerbated in the short term. So you have to look through the uncertainty. There was a phrase that I read one time, and it was when you open the door to go to the next step, the question is always, will I step on firm ground or will I step into space? And the answer is, it doesn't matter. If you step on firm ground, you continue to go. If you step into space, it's time to learn how to fly.
Yeah.
As silly as that sounds, what I want to bring home to people is we have to be adaptive. And what uncertainty does is it says you're going to have to adapt. And we all live in an uncertain world. So trying to reduce uncertainty in the overall context by trying to say, well, just make uncertainty go away is impossible. What you have to recognize is that uncertainty is there, and our strength is when we start saying, I can deal with uncertainty. Right. I can be flexible. I can be adaptable to deal with the change as it comes forward. And so as I see that change happening, again, it's uncertain, gather the data, gather as much information from your experience, the things you touch, the things you feel, the things you see, the real hard data in terms of numbers with customers, sales, costs, supply chain timelines, things like that. Gather that and start saying, okay, now what happens is I'm taking away uncertainty and replacing it with a measure of risk. So how risky will it be if I continue to buy my products from China, or if I buy it from Japan, or if I'm buying it from, say, the Philippines? So now you can start to address those by looking around and saying, instead of saying, I'm uncertain what the tariffs will be, you start saying, hey, in the event of different potentialities, I can now start to make decisions.
Yeah. It's like that other maxim, if you don't know where you're going, all roads will take you there.
Yeah, all roads will get you there, right? Yeah,
if you lead up to to just happenstance and you don't really put any action into it, you're not going to get anywhere, and you're going to be overtaken by others that might have thought about it before you and made decisions and made plans and then executed. If there's a big tariff coming in from China, maybe there's other places you can look for your manufacturing resources, your supply chain.
So let's take a look, some examples of companies we know that really faltered. Sears they were originally a mail order catalog company, which became what we now call a traditional retailer, meaning brick and mortar. And they were the most successful brick and mortar retailer. When electronic commerce came along, it was an alternative. The problem they had was, well, we have all these stores. We know how to operate stores. Do we know how to operate in electronic commerce? How would we make any money in electronic commerce? How would it work? Not knowing how to take a step forward, they chose not to take that step into the new marketplace. Of course, we know where Sears ended up, right? And so newspapers are another good example. I had several interactions with newspapers 15 years ago when the internet came along, and I wrote to a lot of journalists. Then I wrote to the editors of the business section of the New York Times, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times. These are people that I had not a great relationship with, but I had an email connection with these people. And I would say, look, you keep writing about what's changed. What's going to happen to your newspaper because you're relying on these subscription revenues, ad revenues. And if you look at what's happening with information on the internet, in the early days, it was all free everywhere, and nobody paid a subscription. Then people had to learn to generate money from ads. But where they got dollars and dollars for ads in a print magazine, it was pennies and pennies on the online world. And they were like, we don't know how to deal with that. We don't know how to make the business model work in a world in which there's no subscriptions, which is what it was like then. And the ads are so much cheaper, and we don't really place ads on a page. It somehow gets placed next to a column. We just don't understand that. And so what do we have today? Very few surviving newspapers.
Right. It's the ostrich effect, right? Put your head in the sand.
Yeah. And so that's the difference between uncertainty and risk. So what we need to be doing now, and what I would encourage all of our small, mid-sized business owners and leaders out there, is to be saying, look, as much as you might say nothing's going to happen until January 5th or 6th when the administration changes, you're right. I mean, there's nothing that the new administration can do until they are in place. But they are giving a lot of signals, right? Then they're talking to the media. They're putting out a lot of signals about kind of what they intend to do. That gives you a direction. And so now I start accumulating that and start saying, well, wait a minute, where are my risks? So rather than saying, what's the uncertainty about China, say, well, what would happen if there were tariffs of 25%? And take a look at your bill of materials. Take a look at your incoming products. How would I be affected by this? You might discover that your competitors are much more reliant upon a Chinese import than you are.
Right.
You might have perhaps been importing product that came from Vietnam. And now we don't see any chance. There's nobody's talking about putting tariffs into Vietnam. And so what happens is if your competition has been importing product from China and you've been importing from Vietnam, you could be competitively better positioned. So you can say, hey, when this administration comes in, I should maybe really go at this hard because it's a chance for me to take advantage. So you take this uncertainty and you start to turn it into a measurable risk. What's my risk? What's my competitor's risk? And then you can start to make effective decisions. So what's important, again, to come back to this, is that we're trying to make sure that we know the difference between risk and uncertainty. We'll often try to say that something that is uncertain is risky. And what we're going to understand is that's not necessarily true. In fact, it's often not true, that it's just uncertain. And once you collect the data or you think through the options, what happens is now it becomes a risk and you can assess a risk. You can say, well, I think there's a 10%, 20% or whatever chance, or you don't even have to do percentages. That's one of the things I've seen people get caught up in. What's the chance? I always do this thing like, well, okay, if I give you a coin and you flip it, what's the chance it's going to be heads or tails? 50-50, right? So let's say you flip the coin 4 times and it comes up head 4 times in a row. What's the chance that the next one's going to be heads?
50-50.
50-50. So many people are like, well, it just came up heads 4 times in a row. I can't believe it come up heads 5 times in a row. And I'll tell them, look, if you flip that coin often enough, there'll be a time when it'll do 100 heads in a row. But by the time you do 10,000, it will come out 50-50. So don't get confused when you're looking at information, right? Don't come in and say, oh, okay, so I saw this once, twice, 3 times. Now you got to start to say, okay, does that mean that it's going to go somewhere different? Or does that mean confirmation bias starts to set in? And you go, oh, I saw it happen 3 times in a row, so therefore I expect it to happen the 4th time. I used to have a lot of fun doing this with Mary Lou when we would go play roulette in Vegas. She would see numbers like red versus black, or she would see, odds versus evens, and she would see them getting on a run. And she would say, oh, look, it's been 3 evens in a row. I'm going to bet on even. And I would always look at her and say, that doesn't change
matter,
the
right?
probability at all. The ball goes down, right? But she had confirmation bias. When she would see it multiple times in a row, she would say, okay, I'm getting a confirmation bias. So that's, again, why we want to sit back and say, wait a minute, you're uncertain what to do, but don't forget the long-term trend. So don't forget that long-term, there is environmental awareness out there. In the short term, we understand there's probably going to be opening up additional drilling sites, mining sites. There are a number of things that will be done in the short term and in the new administration to improve the production of fossil fuels. What will that do? It'll probably lower the price of fossil fuels unless Saudi Arabia curls back, in which case it'll probably stay the same place where it is now. But in 10 years, what's it going to look like? Well, in 10 years, we know with the impact of other countries and what other countries are likely to do and where we're headed, in 10 years, the other countries are going to keep going down the electrification road, including China, including Eastern Europe. They're going to keep going electrical. If you don't keep going down that road, what's going to happen is you might have some very inexpensive fossil fuel for the next 4 years, but then all of a sudden you could be thrown into a world where the fossil fuels are much more expensive and you're behind because you didn't stay on understanding where the long-term trend was going to end up.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head with that particular powerful B word and bias. I think a lot of people don't make decisions because of bias, but also because of comfort. Right, making a change is not comfortable. Going after something that is transforming an uncertainty into a risk that you can actually work on is not easy, and it's uncomfortable. So some people just don't make any action, don't do anything, and hope for the best. All the while, their competitors are making changes, which actually brings me to this. So if you're If your supply chain is heavily reliant on China and these other places that might be affected, guess what? They're also looking at ways to mitigate their own issues. So if you've got a good relationship with these vendors, why not reach out to them and say, hey, listen, this is what may happen. What are you planning to do in order to keep your business going? And maybe there's some place you guys can work together.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You want to see all the constituents you work with. Your employees are constituency. In the owner, if you're the owner of the business, you're the investor, and you're a constituency. Your bank might be associated with you. You might have investors. That's one constituency. Are the investors in the business financial side? The second one is your employees. A third one is the community in which you operate,
Yeah.
and you could call that the marketplace, the technology community, or you could say, if you depending on your business, it might have a lot to do with the physical locations where you are. And then your suppliers is another important community that you deal with, the constituency. And so you should be talking to all of your constituencies right now about kind of where they see things headed. So you might be guessing what your supply chain is going to do when if you call up your supplier and their whole business is reliant upon shipping a product from a foreign location, they might have a much better beat on it than you could
Mm-hmm.
obtain just by trying to read independent sources. So you should be asking your employees, what do they know? Asking your customers, what do they know? Asking your community and asking your suppliers, what do they know? And then using that again to reduce the uncertainty and turn it into a measurable risk.
Yeah, there's a pro tip that I'll share with the audience that when I ran my company back in the mid-teens, I think in 2016, 2017, we were having some issues with some of our suppliers actually in China. And I actually reached out to some of the people that we worked with on shipping. Think of it like the FedExes of the world, but more specialized. And those folks had a tremendous amount of insight as to what was happening on the ground over there in China. I mean, they're talking to these folks all the time. So just a little bit of a pro tip that if you work with your vendors that are providing shipping, they might have some interesting insights as to how people are mitigating these things that might be coming to pass, like the tariffs or whatever. So just something to share with the audience.
Well, and this is important. Again, small, medium-sized businesses. If you're running a dry cleaners or a cleaning service or a laundry service, where do your supplies come from, right? You've taken it for granted for a long time, but that could be changed. And all of a sudden, you could start seeing some of your supplies go up 25, 30% cost. If you run a small market, like a bodega in your town, and you're sourcing products that people keep, you're not a super grocery store like Kroger, but you've got products around. Well, what's that supply chain look like? If Mexico gets slapped with a 10, 15, 20% tariff, like we've heard could happen, and you've been sourcing, say, your produce out of Mexico, getting it locally, being very, very competitive with the giant supermarkets, you might see that you're going to have to start talking to people about whether that's going to work or not. Or those prices going to go up. So if you're running a restaurant and you've been selling a certain ethnicity food, you might be looking at some of your supplies going up a lot, or all I'm getting at is maybe it's time you'd have to say, look, I've been sourcing some of my raw materials from another location, some of my spices or whatever, maybe the meats or whatever from from an offshore. Basically, you're buying them through a organization, and the organization, Cisco or whoever's sourcing that product from offshore. You might start saying, I need to look for some local suppliers. Because the imported product could be jacked up 25%, maybe it's time I start getting the product from a local supplier. Don't wait. That's the whole key here. It's uncertain what the future is going to be, but reduce the uncertainty by gathering data and then turning the uncertainty into saying, well, how risky is this likely to be? How risky? And you can start saying, what? They could jack up the cost of my meat or whatever by 20%. But the reality is then I could just source it from a local vendor that's here in the same state or in my region, and I could buy that with a 10% more than what it costs me today, but I'm still going to be quite a bit less than it would be to stay with my traditional vendor. So now you've confronted the uncertainty and turned it into an opportunity to make an intelligent decision.
And I think in the last 5 minutes of the podcast here, I want to take one big subject that is probably happening a lot right now, and then sort of feather in this discussion of risk and uncertainty. And that is the idea of people doing strategic plans. Normally in the fall, you're looking at what's happening in the new year. What are the changes happening? Are you going to hire more people? Are you going to fire more people? What's going to happen with your business? And I think that it's really important in that process, which, by the way, Adam and I suggest you are continuously doing a strategic plan and not just one magic day where you create this tome, then you just put it on the shelf. You're actually doing it continuously. But I know a lot of folks don't do that. Most folks don't. They're actually doing it about right now. They sit around on a Friday afternoon and they say, okay, what's going to happen next year? I think it's radically important for you to take the risk and uncertainty conversation that we're talking about now and put it into that process so that you can really look at what's happening this new year and beyond and make the right decisions.
One of the most important things that you can be doing today is reducing uncertainty for your customers. Let's take this whole conversation we're having. Everybody's uncertain. Nobody knows what's going to happen. And this reaches all the way up to the top of the biggest corporations like Apple. And, we're seeing CEOs of major corporations fly to Mar-a-Lago because they're trying to figure out what the future is going to be. So everybody's got a lot of uncertainty. But if you can dig in and start to understand your side of the business, then you could be in a position to go to your customers and say, you know what? We see 2, 3 potential scenarios out there. Here's what they look like, and here's how we see it impacting you. Here's what we are thinking we will do as a supplier to you. When you reduce your customers' uncertainty, they will like you a lot. And so it's not. We tend to we create relationships with customers that become very transactional. I sell to you, you buy, and you pay me X. And what we're doing here is discussing how much you're going to buy and how much you're going to pay for what you buy. And every once in a while, a little bit of adjustment around what you buy. But if you're really thinking about a relationship, it's like, what's my value proposition? We've talked about that a lot. One of your value propositions with your customers right now could be, can you reduce their uncertainty? Can you help them think about what they want to do? If they're stuck because they don't know what the future is going to look like, and you can come in and offer them some insight and say, I think that this is likely to be some risk for you, and then say, and we've got an answer. We think we could help you answer that problem. We think you could help solve that problem. Look at what you've done. You've really improved the relationship. You've improved your value to them. Now, you might see that this means you'll have to do more with your value delivery system. You might have to add some products or distribution services or change some pricing formula. You might have to make some changes in your value delivery system to make it work. But that's what business is really all about. That's the adaptability that can make you really, really successful. The adaptability to prepare for the future, to prepare for uncertainties, be reactive to those uncertainties in a very proactive way, and thereby do well for you and your customers. Doing well for your customers has never put anybody out of business.
Very, very true. This was a very powerful message, Adam, that we discussed today. And I think that there's a lot of meat on these bones for exploration and discussion. And I wish that everybody in a leadership position can take these things and apply them in your business, understand the difference between risk, uncertainty, and how you can really help your customers reduce their uncertainty and in the process make more money and secure a better relationship with your customers.
And I want to end on one final note about what you said earlier, which is around us as people and the behaviors we undertake. It was about 14 years ago when I was living in Chicago, and I'd been there for 25 years, and I started saying, I'm going to move to Las Vegas. And when I did this, I ended up buying a lot and building a house. It was going to take 2 years between when I said I was going to move and when I was going to move. And so I had all my friends and people I knew from 25 years in Chicago, and they're listening to me, and we're going along life's normal. But we're getting closer and closer and closer to this day when I'm going to have to move to Las Vegas, and I'm going to sell my house of 25 years. And what happened at the very end was really fascinating because they came to me. A lot of my friends come to me in groups. And they'd be like, are you going to move? And I'd be like, of course I'm going to move. I've been telling you for 2 years I'm going to move. And they're like, well, yeah, we never really thought you'd do that. We thought that, you had a pipe dream and you went out and you were doing this. But at the end of the day, you don't know anybody in Vegas. You don't know anything about Las Vegas. You don't know. That's miles and miles away from here. It's a whole different world. It's a whole different culture. You wouldn't know the first thing about where to get your car fixed or any of that kind of stuff. And I looked at them and I realized that they were absolutely correct. I didn't know any of that. But I was ready to adapt. I was ready to move. I knew that if I stayed in Chicago, where I didn't like the weather. I was not happy there with the weather. I didn't have any family in the area. I mean, there's nothing that really, I kept looking at what's in Chicago for me. And I'd come to the conclusion that wasn't where I was going to grow. I wasn't going to become a better person in Chicago. I needed to change so that I could grow. Then that meant that I was going to have to take that step through the door, and I was going to have to learn how to fly. And yeah, when I first got to Vegas, there was a lot of stuff I didn't know. But the reality was I adapted pretty darn quickly. And, I've never been sorry that I left Chicago and never been sorry that I moved. So as people out there, I encourage you to realize that just because you don't know what's going to happen when you take off, when you step through that door, have faith. Have faith in yourself. Whenever the road of life has many chasms, have faith. The earlier you jump across the chasm, the more likely you will succeed.
Very well said, Adam. Great message, and happy to share this message with all of our listeners. We'll talk to you next week, Adam. Cheers.
Cheers.